Welcome to my home office and to my desktop, which is what you are looking at right now. As promised, I will be doing a couple of videos digging into the backgrounds of the Bear Awakener album and about the research and science behind it. And before we get to the very juicy things about the mythology and poetry and the art itself, I want to draw your attention to the history of sciences and the history of research in Siberia. And this research is very important to us in Finland in many quite special ways. I think the Finnish scientists and they were mainly linguistics, and they had a little bit of a different motivation to the Siberian studies than the rest of the world did. So hope you find this interesting. The very beginning, or the most important scientist for the Bear Awakener album is this guy, Artur Connisto, who traveled to Siberia in 1901 and spent there 8 years. And he traveled to the areas where the Hanti and Mansi people were living. This picture is in the Pelimka region, and here's Connisto himself working with Fyodor Yeblankov, who looks a relatively young man there, but was known as a very proficient folk singer, and he actually. One of the Bear Awakening songs, the actual songs for the awakening of the bear, was recorded from him to this to these materials. So to understand Artur Connisto and his quest to Siberia, we need to go back in history and see what has happened in Siberia and in the research before. And with a quick glance to the map here, there's Finland and me, yay, Kokkola, Finland. The Siberia would begin roughly from here, like Novaya Zemlya Island, and continues down to the Ural Mountains, which split the Europe from Asia, and that's also where the Siberia begins towards the east. On the 17th century, the colonization of Siberia truly began. So the most important artifacts that people were after were fur. So it was really about fur trade and let's be honest, exploiting the area and exploiting the natural resources of the area. And this is what the Russian or the European states were doing broadly all over the world at that time. We are talking about the prime time of colonization, where no questions were even asked about the morality or importance of it. It was just like basically conquering the world. And together with this colonization and exploitations of the natural resources, there was a scientific movement. They were interconnected in a most intricate way, because part of the science was about understanding the world, but it also was about finding new sales items, creating new medicines, for example, and biology and natural sciences were the most prominent field of science in this respect, in this time. So what happened in the 17th century before any scientist came in was that hunters and settler colonialists basically were moving from the south and from the Moscow region or Saint Petersburg region further to the east and further to north. And while they hunted down game and the most expensive animals for fur, the most wanted furs, when they hunted those animals down to close to extinction, they wanted to go further to the wilderness, further east. And this was a beginning to a conquering of the entire area that is now known by the Russia North and Siberia. The trading posts for those fur required Kazakhs to give protection to trading posts, and there was also armed conflicts between the local people and the settlers, and to ensure the safety of the invaders, they started building castles, and little by little the first towns were established in Siberia, and by the beginning of the 18th century or mid 18th century, some of these cities were actually already quite notable in size. And the science, the actual know-how, who were these people, who were the original inhabitants of the land, who were the hunters before the settlers, and all of these questions were quite open. And the science was mainly based on rumors that the traders had told when returning to Europe, and basically a lot of it was fantasy. And also some of the rumors were coming from the indigenous cultures of the time. I mean, if you know that one of your relatives has been badly treated by the invasive settlers, and then they come all friendly in knocking at your door and your territory, asking for the best places to fish and hunt, maybe you didn't tell them the truth. Maybe you came up with stories about evil spirits and all kinds of monsters, so people would stay away. So these kind of colored stories of Siberia were quite common. Some of them, of course, originated from just the explorers and travelers making their stories more juicy. But anyways, there was not that much truth into the stories that people in Europe heard in the early 18th century. So to kind of fix that problem, the first scientific explorations to Siberia started as early as beginning of the 18th century. Maybe a few needs to be mentioned. Daniel Gottlieb Messerschmitt from Germany was active around the 1710, 1720. He was a natural scientist and focused on plants and species. But at that time, people were also not making a big separation between the original cultures, the indigenous cultures, and the plants or animals. They kind of went together in the same studies. So the first forms of ethnography and study of people was actually conducted by people whose main focus was on plants and fauna. And of course, that science was related to the exploitation again, finding the best places to hunt, finding the best and the safest routes to travel, finding areas where the settlers could actually form bigger cities that would have possibly land that can be cultivated to farming, and all of these were the leading questions. And then we move closer to the end of the 18th century, where the ethnography and the people start to gain a little bit more oomph around them, a little bit more interest. Who are these people? So that's briefly the history of Siberian research before anyone from Finland joins into the game. And the first Finnish scientist to travel to Siberia was Matthias Aleksanteri Castrén, who did his first travel there in 1840s. And he was very notable scientist as a linguist. He actually finished doing some sort of a grammar of 14 different indigenous languages in his lifetime. So there is a big shift happening with the Finnish scientists into the linguistics and really hardcore linguistics, like truly understanding the languages in a most detailed level. And of course, when we start to think of language, we inevitably come towards worldviews, the cosmos and cosmology. Because in order to understand where do the words come from, where do our expressions come from, we need to understand the thinking behind it, and the thinking comes from observing the world. So this is a major shift, and actually all of the explorers and scientists from Finland going to Siberia, all of them were primarily linguists. So language was their number one priority in everything that they did, and thus they ended up collecting folk songs, and this is also something that we don't quite understand often, that the mythologies and the creation stories and all of these things, they are most often preserved as in a form of a song. So most of the folk poems that we look at are actually lyrics to a song. So this is a musical tradition, not just poetry. Finland itself wasn't a nation yet. We were not independent. We were for a long time under the Swedish rule and then under the Russian rule, and there was this mystery of where did our language come from. Like, we still talk about this, that the Finnish language is not related to Swedish, Norwegian, Danish, Icelandic, the rest of the Scandinavia. Like, if you want to speak of Scandinavia, you should say Fenno-Scandinavia to acknowledge that the Finnish are awkward. So why linguists? That was one of the big questions at the time, and still is a big question. Where did our language come from? And Castrén was one of the scientists developing the linguistic theory of family relations that shows that there is a family relation between the Finnish and the Sami and the Estonian and the peoples on the Volga river district, the Udmurt, Mari, and all the way to the Siberia, to the Selkup, Ostyak, Hanti nowadays. This time they were called Ostyak and Vogul. Today we know them as Hanti and Mansi. And Hungarians, that would be the closest linguistic relatives to the Hanti. So the Hungarian researchers and the Finnish researchers, they both have this question of understanding something about ourselves as well as studying a foreign culture. So to us, the indigenous cultures weren't just others in the same sense that they were for the settler colonialists in 17th century and to the scientists of 18th century. There was a deeper question there about our identity and our mystery of where did we come from. And throughout our history, we've had different answers to that question, and those answers are of course politically shaped. So what answer is politically benefiting the nation the most is usually the theory that we tend to believe in. But that doesn't change the fact that that it's a deep question. Who are we? Where did we come from? And that question is actually shaping the thinking and shaping the research of the Finnish early scientists. Another thing driving Artur Connisto forward in his studies in Siberia was a worry that these minorities would cease to exist. And of course this was something that was happening all over the world. The colonization wasn't easy on the original inhabitants of the earth. So already at that time there was this big question with these scientists that they need to go there now before the cultures die out. And this is again a very typical narrative of colonialistic thinking. We don't really want to credit the indigenous cultures and indigenous peoples for their resilience, which is outstanding. I mean, they've survived. Thinking of these areas in Siberia, these indigenous peoples inhabiting these areas, they've survived the first wave of settlers and exploitation. They've survived the alcohol brought by them. They've survived the Crusades and the arrival of Christianity. They've survived the communism and the Stalin regime that killed most of their shamans brutally. They've survived that, and personally I wouldn't be that surprised if they last longer than capitalism does. So I really want to give credit to the resilience of these people, and why they are resilient is that their connection to nature is both self-sufficient and also in harmony with the nature, so they don't exploit the area to the end as the first settlers already did, killing an animal to the near extinction and then moving further to find more of it. That's not quite what the indigenous cultures do. So they often see themselves as caretakers of the land, which is a sacred position to be. So their way of hunting is never about gaining profit through killing a species to its end. So they have a very different perspective to the land, and that perspective is both sustainable and self-sufficient. So a lot of catastrophes can happen, and they can still survive and keep on living. And as for myself, I was also worried when in my own time, in my first travels to Siberia. The same worry was motivating me, sort of finding things when they can still be found. And I think one of the questions that connects my personal thinking as well as the early researchers was an understanding that we here in Finland, our ancestors were hunter-gatherers, not farmers, and the rest of the Europe and Scandinavia, they see their history as beginning from farming. So that's something else to think about. That maybe these songs, maybe these poems and myths, they are an example of a hunter-gathering culture that is still going strong, that is still alive and well. So maybe by studying them we can understand something about ourselves in Finland. So this is maybe the biggest motivation I have in these studies. Understanding life, understanding what could be done better, understanding myself, understanding why I don't comply so easily with the modern world. Why do I feel differently about a lot of things in relation to nature than so many other people around me do? So this is kind of, in a nutshell, where the material is coming from, and in the next episode we'll dig in to the actual poems. Thank you for watching.